Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, especially on this very sunny, warm day. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery. And it's really a pleasure to see you all this evening for the next in our series of Unexpected View talks. This is a series where we invite a contemporary artist into the National Gallery to choose a painting from the collection, and have a conversation in front of that painting to talk about why they're interested in that work, but also to find the shared themes and ideas with their own work. It's a way for us to explore a painting in a different way, but also to learn about how artists work in the myriad of ways that they do today. Now, that's the usual format for these evening's talks. We're doing something quite unusual for this evening. As you can see, we're not standing in front of a painting. We're expanding from the format even more with our current artist in residence, Katrina Palmer. Katrina has instead chosen this entire gallery, room 18, to speak about this evening. We'll find out more about this during the talk this evening. But before I continue, we should thank, as ever, Hiscox as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner for their support of this evening's event. As the National Gallery's artist in residence, Katrina is working in our on-site studio for a year to produce new work and develop her practice within the context and resources of the museum. The programme is a partnership with a different museum outside of London each year, and this time we're working with Touchstones in Rochdale. They will acquire a new work made by Katrina during the residency for their permanent collection, and this is supported by the Contemporary Art Society through the generosity of Anna Yang and Joseph Schul. Later this year, we will be presenting some of Katrina's work in the galleries, so I welcome you all back here in December when we will launch the project. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Katrina Palmer is an artist based here in London, and her practice encompasses sculpture, writing, drawing, audio environments, performance, and video. She's best known for her investigations of sculptural materiality, which often involve written compositions and site-specific recordings to explore histories of absence within landscapes or institutional spaces. Her commission End Matter for Artangel in 2015 saw her situated on the Isle of Portland, where its famous Portland stone is quarried. And that stone, you'll recognise, it's that white stone that is on the facade even of the National Gallery, of our celebrated buildings here in London. On Portland, she produced an audio tour based on her writing during her residency on the Isle, which was turned also into a play for Radio 4 and a publication in the form of an artist's book, also titled End Matter. Now, this book is one of 4 publications that Katrina has published as a key strand of her practice that explore the potential of language in the endeavour for sculptural materiality through layered narratives and images. The other titles include The Dark Object, Reality Flickers, and Black Slit. And actually, I encourage you all to search them out. They're still all available online through the publisher Bookworks. So I recommend going to the website and purchasing your copies. While absence is an interest that straddles many of Katrina's projects, there is also a confrontation with institutions, which challenges them through dry wit and this acute observation. Katrina's previous exhibitions include the Necropolitan Line at the Henry Moore Institute in 2015, the 1418 Now commissioned The Coffin Jump, which is situated in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in 2018, Hello Retreat for the Creative Coast programme in Southend in 2021, and last year, what's already going on at the Mead Gallery. In 2014, she was awarded the Paul Hamlin Foundation Award for Artists and was shortlisted for the Contemporary Art Society Annual Award in 2015. She completed her PhD at the Royal College of Art in 2012, and Katrina is currently an associate professor of sculpture at the Slade School of Art. So please join me in welcoming Katrina. So to begin, Katrina, we always start with a conversation with a question. So why did you bring us to Gallery 18 for this evening's talk?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and to talk about a painting in the collection. And I've decided to talk about this wall, this empty wall. And when I first inquired about this wall, as you know, I discovered that there is some work going on behind it, building work, and the building work shakes the wall. So this is a vibrating wall, and the vibrations cause the painting that was here to shake. And the shaking, obviously, is really bad for old paintings, so the painting was displaced. I was really fascinated, as you know, Priyesh, with how the institution would respond to this kind of change that had to happen. Particularly thinking about how change sort of ripples through, has a sort of ripple effect through the institution. Sometimes that's quite a gentle thing, but it can also be quite terribly disruptive. And I think any kind of movement has a sort of is a change that an institution of this kind can find difficult, particularly somewhere that has a sense of a sort of aura of permanence and stability about it. So I started to sort of look further into that, the sort of repercussions of this movement. And I asked you, what was the painting that was moved from here? I thought that was quite a sort of simple sort of question, but little did I know the kind of Kafkaesque, disorienting kind of complexity of the situation that unfolded. But it started with your response to me. What was the painting that used to be here? And this is how it started with your email. I'm going to read your email. So you said, what's the date of this? Was the 14th of June, you wrote Priyesh to Katrina. Bart, that's Bart Cornelis, who's the curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings. Bart has just come back to us. He's a little unsure, as so much has moved around since Samson and Delilah was displaced from the back wall. But there are two paintings that would be in the room that aren't in there anymore. I think both are in store. There's Drunken Silenus, supported by Satyrs by Van Dyck's studio, and Rubens' The Judgment of Paris. The main reason for moving the paintings around in room 18 was because the building works in the Learning Centre were causing vibrations on the end wall. Samson and Delilah is on panel, so it's very vulnerable to vibrations. And when I say I'm standing in for Priyesh, okay, I was going to try to translate Bart's message, but here's what he says. So now Priyesh is standing in for Bart. It proves difficult to reconstruct this because things were even more frequently on the move than I remembered because of the ongoing vibration problems. So while I'd initially put the probably by Van Dyck Silenus on the vista wall where Samson and Delilah was, because it's on canvas and not as vulnerable as Samson and Delilah, which is a panel painting, that was eventually removed because the vibrations were too strong even for a canvas painting. Silenus then went on a bit of a wander through the North Galleries, which is almost impossible to reconstruct. I think that the main thing that was rearranged on the west wall, and here Bart's referring to this kind of knock-on effect. I think the main thing that was rearranged on the west wall was because of the removal of Rubens' late judgment of Paris for conservation treatment, but that was post the moving of Samson and Delilah. I hope this is helpful. So that was the end of the email, and thank you for that information. So these sort of displacements are part of what fascinates me, and with that in mind, with the painting having moved from the wall, with it having moved around the room, other paintings having moved out of the way, with you standing in for Bart, with me reading on your behalf, I'm actually now going to move out of the way, and we're going to have someone else speak for me. So I'm going to introduce Ricardo G Mares, who is an artist in his own right, and he will read the text that I've written to you.
Movement reverberates through the institution and creates tensions. These vibrations shake the paintings. Movements are created by and pass through anybody's standing or sitting in the room. And as the artist in residence, my own body is subject to the same forces daily. I've been figuring out how to manage the vibrations and the stresses of this situation. The conservators who attend to the paintings had to displace some of them, and I've stepped away from performing this talk. To my mind, withdrawal can be a legitimate response in the face of pressure. It's fascinating and at times disturbing to be surrounded by so many paintings. When I first stepped into this room, I saw the opulence conveyed in gold and red and the excess of pale skin tones of women presented as tumbling masses of bodies in a variety of violent come sexual, vaguely S&M type scenarios. The room is saturated with turbulence. For example, here on my right, in the middle of the room, there's a painting that combines a battle between armor-clad, dagger-wielding men falling into a group of small children. These children, accompanied by a reckless adult, are creeping towards a half-goat, half-man who's trying to tempt them, with what is literally a giant horn protruding from between his thighs. From the top of his horn, an abundance of fruit erupts and conceals a snarling leopard that's ready to claw the children to shreds, while a woman sits at the center of the scene, squeezing her own nipple that shoots a jet of milk towards a nearby toddler. Another woman, to the far side, happily shakes her tambourine. As she flings her arms in the air, the top of her dress forms narrow twists of fabric that strap around her exposed breast, forcing it to pop out, which is something of a recurrent incident in the room. That's just one painting, and the first I really looked at here. But remembering that these are illusionary presences and the space inside them is imagined, I turned away and started to focus on the three-dimensionally present physical structures. A considerable amount of architecture supports the paintings in the form of chains, frames, panels, canvases, and glass, but the work remains vulnerable. I became increasingly conscious of the images residing in a shallow layer of paint and the challenges of relying almost solely on very thin rectangular panes of viscous material. Without the frame, without the varnish, and without canvas or panel, the paint itself is generally below 1 millimeter in thickness. According to the gallery's scientific team, many of the paintings are between 0.1 and 0.2 of a millimeter deep. Reverent public and academic attention is absorbed in these vivid, low-relief surfaces that represent years of dedicated expert conservation, restoration, and curation. The collection is carefully attended to and preserved and monitored as if under life support. Understandably, given its value and the extent of its influence, but at less than a hair's breadth and brittle, it's surprising that so many survive. It struck me that the collection's power resides in this fraction of a millimeter thin edifice that's sustained in defiance of crumbling away. And this situation of extreme physical tension resonates with the images in the paintings themselves, where depictions are of intimate material encounters, pressure, insecurities, and confrontations with mortality. I wanted to know more about the physical dynamics that sustain the collection. I was told that senses judge and respond to the balance between daylight and artificial light. A degree of vibration is tolerated, or rather can be counteracted by the fixtures at the top of the chains that at the ceiling level around this room and in many other rooms in the gallery. These fittings are calibrated to prevent any movement in response to sound or other forms of vibration that can damage the works. Shaking cracks the medium that could ultimately fail, meaning holes would appear in the paint surface that would fall away, resulting in its loss. In other words, so long as this wall behind me continues to vibrate, it cannot host a painting. And according to Priesh's email, there are 3 paintings that were displaced. Rubens' Samson and Delilah was definitely here. It's still in the room, but now at the far end to my right. The painting depicts a woman in a red dress with a man laying on her lap. It's the stillness and quietness of the scene that struck me. In the context of this vibrating room, the painting captures the sense of breath held to keep still and prevent damage to the works. The man lies with his head resting just under the woman's exposed breasts. Here again, the breasts are bound by improbable twists of fabric in a bondage-like gesture that forces them to pop forward. But her focus is on the man. He's asleep and vulnerable. The woman's assistant has a pair of open scissors poised to cut the man's hair, an act that will instantly terminate his physical prowess. Everything hinges on this moment of concentrated stillness before change. He sleeps, In the background, there's a motionless statue. And in shadows, at the doorway, soldiers spy on the scene, waiting silently and watching the woman's heaving breasts. These are the only things that move before the snap of the scissors. It's Samson's strength that's at stake, and for me, this resonates with the theme in the gallery's edifice, the construction and assertion of power that is susceptible to failure. Priesh's email next mentions Rubens' two versions of the Judgment of Paris. Since moving from the wall behind me, the later painting was first taken into conservation and then returned to the room last month. It is at the far end of the wall to my left. Immediately next to the later Judgment of Paris is Rubens' earlier version of the same theme with the same title. There's a man in the painting. He's staring at three naked female figures, deciding which one of them is the most beautiful. They're competing for his judgment. The exposed women were originally clothed, but the man has asked them to undress to help him make a decision. Other men peer at the women from a variety of vantage points. In the early version, the man who's assessing and passing judgment is naked like the women, but unlike them, he's seen from behind. And in the later painting, he makes his assessment fully clothed and from a seated vantage point. I thought about these works in relation to movement and was conscious of the temporal oscillations that occur here. Time can be traced, fluctuating across versions of the same subject, as well as within the scene itself. Several reworked positionings are visible. For example, in the early work, an underdrawing shows the movement of the protagonist's arm. In the later, the lowering of the hand with the apple is retraced, as is the reorientation of the leg. Nothing is stable. Going back to the email, the curator, Bart, doesn't mention Rubens' The Rape of the Sabine Women because it wasn't on this vibrating wall, but it was displaced. It was shifted along the wall towards this end of the room to create space for the Judgment of Paris. It's here to my left. The rape scene is an extraordinarily vivid and distressing image of a brutal assault depicted through rich golden fabrics and swirls of flesh, energy, heated muscular desire, and unchecked masculine aggression. As I don't want to linger on the rape imagery, let's take a moment to consider the wall behind me. Clearly, this wall isn't entirely empty. There's a bar across the top, and the surface of the wall is covered with a fabric richly embossed with a floral motif and the opulent grandeur of its damask. The particular choice of fabric is conspicuously present, but doesn't distract from the paintings. Instead, it adds to an overall sense of heat and turmoil in the room. The color is an unstable pinky red terracotta. It blushes. The final painting, mentioned by Bart, is now in storage, dislodged and in darkness behind the walls of the building. Drunken Selenius, supported by satyrs, was originally thought to be by Van Dyck. But this attribution turned out to be unstable, and the work is now credited to his studio. The volatility that runs through the walls, the paint, and the imagery is also present in the wall texts. And although the collection, as a selection of paintings, is ostensibly static, what is out on display rotates with surprising frequency. Selenius is not on display currently, but if you look at the eventful wall covering behind me, you can see its volatile figures. Drunken Silenius supported by satyrs. It's an outrageously slippery work with a huge and debauched naked old man at its center. Unable to support himself, he slumps backwards. This drunken and slobbering man is a corpulent and fleshy mass of pale pink, prickled by a bright red penis, matched by the color of his cheeks and nose. He's conveyed by a swirling embrace of contorted bodies. There are men who have partially transformed into goats. They support Silenius, carrying him along, as does a man playing two pipes, his cheeks about to burst. Everything is in movement. Here's the fire. To the rear, a man carries a ready gold engraved flagon and brandishes a burning torch. The old drunk carelessly gropes behind himself at an abundant bunch of grapes offered by a giggling child. And a woman squeezes more grapes that dribble juice across his slack and overheated skin. The woman's breast has fallen out of her dress. It's all here. I saw the pink that travels up and across this probably not by Van Dyck painting, bleeding through the swirling imagery from the child's flushed cheeks, through the old man's penis and nipples, across his nose and face, into his wet open lips that glisten and press into the pink red of the young woman's open dress. I saw the circle of silk that shifts and flies up against the sky behind her, to the blush on the skin of an apple hanging from a tree. The paint describes these bodies, but every stroke slides. So the figures appear sloppy and out of control, intentionally so, because nothing here is still. When I think of the collection as a whole, the instability of its condition in practice is in sharp contrast to the impression of permanence that's part of the institution's aura. The sustained effect, a construction that conceals the ongoing unsettlement of the paintings, is hegemonic because the paintings tremble and a huge amount of ongoing work is invested in preventing them from failing. Throughout the galleries, bodies and paint, apparently static, evidently move. The works vibrate and shudder and soak in the context of central London's traffic and tourism, through light, dust splashes, building works, underground trains, and sound waves. Changes of the display see items shift to and from storage or loan. The penetration of screws leaves holes in the wall coverings that reveal the history of curatorial rearrangements. Occasionally, there are new acquisitions, fresh interpretations on the discovery of new evidence, and re-evaluations alter wall texts, because more often than not, there's something missing. There is constant change to the painted object due to aging, damage, cleaning, and retouching. But when I stood in the center of the room and looked back at the imagery, I knew that movement is also felt in the body and in the mind. It's generated enigmatically through the flow of images, references, and color combinations that provoke reflections and stimulate emotional responses. I speak of movement, but in a museum, the changes referred to are only relative. Most often, alterations are simply the circulation of what's already here, as opposed to the radical or transformative introduction of the new. Still, I'm curious about the unsettlement when it reveals spaces like the one behind me that allow movement to take place. It's not unlike a child's vintage sliding space puzzle, where a gap is essential. Without it, there would be no capacity for change. Everything would be fixed and moribund. I have to find ways in and out of this place, and my own access to the collection is through such gaps and displacements, the holes in the facade that allow you to slip in or steal away. I see these tears in relation to the aging membrane of the painted surfaces and the recurrent themes of mortality in the pictures themselves. And I think of my own transient presence. The empty spaces highlight things that are missing and people who are absent or displaced. When the building shakes, it reminds me of these tensions. Thank you.